This Week in Economics from WBRN Radio and on the Bostonred Network, one of the longest running economic programs on the net. You can find us on YouTube, on iHeartRadio, on Stitcher, not Snitcher. I suppose we are snitching on Voodoo Economics, so we can extend it in that direction. On the RSS feed, we are there. We're on Spreaker and various other channels here too. We now even appear, I believe, at Google Podcasts. We have to check that out. And we're at the Apple feed, whatever the Apple feed is. I'm not certain as to what the situation is with Apple, but you can find us on Stitcher, and that covers all mobile devices. Incidentally, most of the people now come to us via a mobile device. You can go, of course, to bostonred.org, and the iHeart players are there, and you can find us there also. This is from the Numbers Man Division, and we partner with Cranston Analytics. Been a very interesting week here. Incidentally, the Potawatomi did not find his shadow, which means a warmer spring. The reason we bring that up, climatic conditions are now playing more and more of a part in all of the models, including from the Federal Reserve. Climate, whether or not it be wildfires on the West Coast, tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, the whole lot. Floods, we don't forget those. It's been made as a bad year for insurance carriers. 2018 was, and 2019 not any better. In the Midwest, upper Midwest, 50 below windshield factors, that's Fahrenheit, and also ground temperatures of 30 below, knocked out all sorts of things, including the rail trains in Chicago. They had to be hand switched, and various other places. Energy companies were not able to handle their customers in places like Michigan and in Minnesota, so it had an economic aspect there, and also some internet services were knocked out, and other things. People were not working on some of the days. There were some states had statewide emergencies. Universities, public schools were closed in Illinois, parts of Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, and in Iowa. So the lot, it was a very costly situation. You had at least 2 days where people did not go to work, could not go to work, and this factors into the equation. Also, the shutdown, we'll talk about it in this broadcast, and we'll also spotlight on China. Those are some of the key points. Now with presentations, you give the key points. We'll start with the U.S. Jobs Report, which was published on the 1st of February, and we'll look at the from the people at the Congressional Budget Office, the impact there of the shutdown, and also we'll go to some of the anecdotal sources. Incidentally, the consensus opinion, at least at Reuters, less than 200,000 jobs were created. Over 300,000 were in fact created, according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis. We'll go to that now. This is on the 1st of February. The total employment increased by 304,000. They used the word non-farm. We're taking that out, and the reason for that is that that is a leftover from the days that the U.S. were an agrarian economy. It's been out of the agrarian economy basically since the end of the Great War. That would be in 1945. The unemployment rate at 4% now doesn't mean a lot's changed to the employment situation. The establishment data has been revised as a result of the annual benchmarking process and the updating of seasonally adjusted factors. Also, the household survey dated January 2019 reflects updated population estimates, and see the notes below. We first go to the household survey. Both the unemployment rate at 4% and the number of unemployed persons at 6.5 million edged up in January. The impact of partial government shutdown, which we call a government shutdown, contributed to the uptick in these measures. Amongst the unemployed, the number who reported being temporarily laid off increased by 175,000. That figure includes furloughed federal workers who were classified as unemployed or temporarily laid off under the definition used in the household survey. Amongst major worker groups, the unemployment rate of Hispanics or Latinos was 4.9% in January. The jobless rate for adult men at 3.7%, adult women at 3.6%, teenagers at 12.9%. For Europeans in general, 3.5%. For African Americans, 6.8%. For Asians, 3.1%. Showed little change over the month. In January, the number of long-term unemployed, those jobless for more than 27 weeks, which is not a lot, was little changed at 1.3 million, accounting for 19.3% of the unemployed. The labor force participation rate at 63.2%, and the employment population ratio at 60.7% was little changed. Both were up 0.5% over the year. The number of persons employed part-time for economic reasons. Involuntary part-time workers increased by 1/2 million to 5.1 million in January. Nearly all these increases occurred in the private sector, meant to reflect the impact of the shutdown. Persons employed part-time for economic reasons would have preferred full-time work, quite obvious. 1.6 million persons were marginally attached to the workforce, essentially unchanged from a year earlier. Discouraged workers, there were 426,000 discouraged workers in January, little change from a year earlier. So we've seen some of the background data here really not change. It's pretty much been a standard for 12 months now. The total payroll employment increased by 304,000 in January, compared with an average gain of 223,000 in 2018. In January, employment grew in several industries, including leisure, hospitality, construction, healthcare, transportation, and warehousing. There was no discernible impact of the government shutdown on the estimates of workers' hours there. In January, leisure and hospitality rose by 74,000. Within the industry, job gains occurred in food service, drinking places, 37,000 there. In amusement, gambling, and recreation created 32,000. Over the year, leisure and hospitality added 410,000 jobs. Construction employment rose by 52,000 in January. Very unusual for January, because usually January would be unseasonably cold, as what happened in the latter part of January. Nonetheless, job gains occurred amongst specific trade contractors, which increased both non-residential at 19,000, residential at 15,000. components. Employment also rose in heavy and civil engineering construction, 10,000 there. Residential building at 9,000. Construction added 38,000 jobs over the past year. Employment in healthcare increased by 42,000. Within the industry, job gains occurred in ambulatory healthcare services at 22,000. Medical centers at 19,000. Healthcare added 368,000 jobs over 2018. Over the year, employment in transportation and warehousing rose by 27,000. That's an interesting sector because robotics will affect this sector. Following a little change in December and January, job gains occurred in warehousing and storage, 15,000. Amongst couriers and messengers, 7,000. Over the year, employment in transportation and warehousing had increased at 219,000 jobs. Very interesting there. Retail trade edged up 21,000. Job gains occurred in sporting goods. That had ticked down. Hobby, book, and music stores. I'm not sure if there are many music stores anymore. 17,000. While general merchandising stores lost 12,000 jobs. Employment in retail trade has shown little net change over the 12-month period of 26,000. Mining increased by 7,000. The industry has added 64,000 jobs over the year. It appears that particular sector's best years are behind it. Let me get back up here. Employment in the federal government was essentially unchanged, 1,000. Federal workers on furlough during the shutdown were counted as employed in the establishment survey because they worked or received pay or will receive pay. That's a very tricky question there. That include the 12th month. It's kind of a little statistical juggling act, I'll call it. Anyway, employment showed little change in wholesale trade, information, and financial activities. The average work week was unchanged at 34.5. In manufacturing, both the work week and overtime decreased by 1/10 hour to 40.8 hours and 3.5 hours respectively. The average work week for production workers in private industry held at 33.7 there. The average hourly earnings for workers in private industry rose by 3 cents to $27.59, following a 10-cent gain in December. Over the year, the average hourly earning has increased by 85 cents, or 3.2%. The average hourly private sector production work increased by 3 cents to $23.12. Sorry about that. Changes in total non-farm payroll employment for November was revised up from 776,000 to 196,000. That's always going on. And the change for January is revised down, plus 312,000 to plus 222,000. With these revisions, unemployment gains in November and December combined were 70,000 less than previously reported. After revision, job gains have on the average at 241,000 per month over the last 3 months. Monthly revisions result in additional reports received from business and government agencies since the last they were down, incidentally, during the shutdown here, and the next one will be in February. Some federal agencies were shut down and operating at reduced staff levels. A lapse in appropriation, and this started on the 22nd of January 2018 through January 25th. The Bureau of Labor Statistics was funded during the shutdown period and operated as usual. Data collection for the household establishment surveys occurred as scheduled. the household surveys, individuals are classified as employed, unemployed, and not in the labor force. I think we'll go ahead and explain these based on a series, on their answers to a series of questions about their activities during the survey reference week. Workers who indicate they were not working during the entire survey reference period are expected to be recalled. Their jobs should be classified as unemployed, on temporary layoff. In January of 2019, there was an increase in the number of federal workers who were classified as unemployed, on temporary layoff. However, there was also an increase in the number of federal workers who were classified as employed but absent from work. The Bureau of Labor Statistics analysis of the underlying data indicates that this group, including a temporary laid off, such as such a misclassification, is an example of non-sampling error and could occur when respondents misunderstood the question or the interviewers answered incorrectly. If the federal worker who was recorded as employed but absent from work had been classified as unemployed on a temporary layoff, the overall unemployment rate would have been slightly higher than reported. However, according to the usual process, the data for the household surveys are accepted as recorded. To maintain data integrity, no ad hoc actions are taken to reassign survey responses. The establishment survey, businesses and government agencies report the number of people on the payroll during the period that included the 12th month. Individuals who worked or received pay for any part of the period are defined as employed. Federal workers on furlough during the shutdown are considered employed in the establishment survey because they work to receive pay or will receive pay. That's a tricky part right there. And other workers, including federal contractors who did not work or receive pay during the shutdown, were not counted as among the employed. Now we got that one straight. Revisions to total non-farm employment in January and December of 2018. And we'll go over January 2018 was 147,801. It was revised to 147,767. Most of these are not big revisions. We'll drop down to August. It was previously published as 149,382. Oh, in thousands. Okay. Anyway, so in actuality, since that is the case, that would be 447. We'll go to millions here in a hurry. The preliminary for December was 150,663,000. Sounds more like it there. Seasonally adjusted in thousands. Oh, okay. Well, anyway. Maybe we won't do that one. There's civilian non-institutional population. We really won't go into that number here. Again, the number in thousands, civilian non-institutional population. Employment status, this would be in January 258, and pretty much ran the whole gamut. In January 219, it was 256. I'm sorry, it's 258 in January of 219, where it would have been 256 in 256,780 in January of 218. Now the employment population ratio at 60.7, that would have been in January of 218, and it was 63.2 in January of 219. Employment population ratio, let's see if we can get it here, participation. Okay. So the unemployment rate actually was in January of 218 at 4.1, and it's very, very little difference at 10%. We won't really get into that one very much at all. The unemployment rates last January was 4.1. I think we talked about that. Adult men 20 and older at 3.9. Adult women at 3.6. Teenagers at 12.9. That was in January of 2018. Europeans at 3.5. African Americans were 7.7. And if we look at Europeans, they're the same, 3.5. African Americans now are 6.8%. In January 2018. Latinos were at 5%, now they're 4.9, at 1/10 there. And high school diplomas at 5.5, it's 5.7 this time around. And let's see, less than, I'm sorry. Well, wait a minute here. 3.4 and 3.3 about the same. High school graduates, no college, 4.4 and 3.8, a little less there. Some college at 3.4 and 3.4 last year, January of 2018. 2019, to say, didn't change. Bachelor's degrees, 2.2 and 2.2 and 2.4. So there was a rise in the unemployment rate for people with bachelor's degrees. As we did a little bit of deep diving here, we'll attach this, so really we'll want to go into the whole scenario. You can read the so-called rules of the road, as one would say. Yeah, we went through the civilian population once before. I think we'll leave it at that, and we'll head on here. Usually this always takes more time. And, okay. Uh-oh. The cost index, we'll get to this one. Employment cost index. Now, this was, when did this appear? On the last day of January the 31st. Let me just go out here and get this one up. The site was down, so we'll kind of go to the PDF so we can increase this a little bit. Anyway, this is released on the last day here. Compensation costs for civilians, that's the employment cost index, watched very closely. For civilian workers, increased 0.7% season adjusted for the 3-month period ending in December of 2018. Wages and salaries, which were up which made up, about 70% of the compensation costs, increased 0.6%, and benefits costs, which were up the remaining 30, increased 0.7% from September of 2018. We'll put this one also because compensation costs for civilian workers increased 2.9%. That's for the 12-month period ending in December of 2018, compared with compensation costs increase of 2.6, that's 0.3%. And this is in 2017. In 2018, it was 0.3% more. Wages and salaries increased 3.1% for the 12-month period ending in December of 2018. And the increase 2.5% for the 12-month period ending in December of 2017. So in 2017, we had 2.5 and a 3.1 there. Benefit costs increased 2.8% for the 12-month period of December 2018. In 17, the increase was 2.5%, 0.3 more in 18. For private industry workers, compensation costs for private industry increased 3% over the year, compared with 2.6% in 2017. Wages and salaries increased 3.1% for 12 months period ending in December. That's 2018, and the increase was 2.8 for the period ending in December of 2017. The cost of benefits rose to 2.6% for the 12-month period ending in 2018, and increased 2.3% in December of 2017. 0.3% increase there. And employees' costs for healthcare benefits increased 1.8% for the 12-month period ending in December of 2018. Amongst occupational costs increased for private industry workers for 12 months ending in December of 2018 ranged from 2.5% for both management, professional, and related occupations, natural resources, construction, maintenance occupations, to 3.8% for sales and office occupations. Amongst the industrial supersector, compensation increased for private workers 12-month period in 2018 ranging from 2.1% for manufacturing to 2.6% for information. Now this is really where you get to see what's going on here. And if you look at 2.1%, manufacturing got less. State and local workers, costs of state and local workers increased by 2.6%. That's in 2018. In 2017, it was 2.5%. I said 2.6, yeah, 2.5%. Wages and salaries increased at 2.4%, 12-month period ending in 2018, compared with a 2.1% in 2017. Benefits costs increased 3.1% for the 12-month period in 2018. The prior year was 3.2%. So they lost 0.1%. Area definitions and seasonal factors. Area definitions have been updated with the release on the Office of Management Budget Bulletin. That will be on February 28th. Major series of employment cost index. So we look at September of 2018, the compensation at 8 temps, wages and salaries at 9 temps, and benefits at 4 temps. In December, it would have been 7 temps for benefits, 8 temps for salaries, and 7 there. Last year would have been 2 temps for December of 2017. You can see the difference there. And in December of, wait a minute, that's a 3-month period. Let me get the 3-month period out of the way here. Okay. Now, the 2 temps would have been in December of 2017. It would have been at 2 temps of compensation, wages and salaries at 2.5%, and benefits at 2.5%. That was in 17. In December of 2018, it would have been 2.8%, 3.1%, and 2.9% respectively. Workers did a little bit better. As civilian workers, private industry compensation at 0.6% in December of 2018, and 0.7 on wages and salaries and benefits at 5 temps. That was in December of 2018. December of 2017. This is where we get into the 12-month adjustable here. I think we went over this. We did. State and local, basically in December, it was 8/10 for compensation. This is state and local workers, and 6/10 for salaries and for salaries, wages, and 1% for benefits. This is in December. In December, actually, of 2017, state workers did better for benefits at 3.2%. Wages and salaries actually, wait a minute. Yeah, 17 and 2.1% for wages and salaries, and 2.5% for compensation. And if we go to December, compensation was at 2.6%, wages and salaries at 2.4%, and 3.1% for benefits. This has been pretty much the whole year here, dropped 1/10%. The next cost index for March is scheduled to be released on April the 30th. And I don't think we have anything else in this. We'll just append it. It is cost index for compensation by occupation groups, depending on where you are there. And as to where the index is here, you can look at it from December. At goods producing industries was at 31.9. Just doing a little sampling here. And percentage change for 3 months ending. And if we run over to December, be 5/10, and this divides manufacturing up. We won't really go into that. Let's go to the Federal Reserve now. This was the statement. We'll put, I believe, at the end of this cast, the statement by Jerome Powell. He is the chair. Information received since the Federal Markets Committee met in December indicated that the labor market has continued to strengthen and that economic activity has been rising at a solid pace. Job gains have been strong. On the average in recent months, the unemployment rate has remained low. Household spending has continued to grow strong, while the growth of business fixed investment has moderated from its rapid pace early last year. On a 12-month basis, the overall inflation for items other than food and energy is near to 2%. That's the Fed target. Although market-based measurements of inflation compensation have moved lower in recent months, the survey based on measurements of long-term inflation expectation a little changed. Consistent with the statutory mandate, the committee seeks to foster maximum employment and price stability. In support of these goals, the committee decided to maintain its target basis of 2.25% to 2.5%. The committee continues to view substantial expansion of economic activity, strong labor market, and inflation near the committee's symmetric 2% objective as a likely outcome. In the light of global economic or financial developments, muted inflation pressures, the committee will be patient. And that is, excuse me, basically the takeaway from the committee. In determining the timing and size of future adjustments to the target rate for federal funds, the committee will assess realized and expected economic conditions relative to the maximum employment objective and its symmetric 2% inflation rate. The assessment will take into account a wide range of information, including the measurement of labor market conditions, indicators of inflation pressures and expectations, and reading on financial and international developments. That's a very long situation there, and then it just says the members that were voting in favor, and they all did: Powell, Williams, Boatman, Bullard, Bullard, Evans, and old Esther George, old Esther George, anyway, and Rosinger. Anyway, that's those that were in favor of this situation. So the economy, as one would say, moves on. Let me just check and see. Oh, we get to the office of this is public held debt. The federal deficit rose substantially. The debt to 100% of GDP by 2028. The CBC's baseline projection, which incorporates assumptions, this is always on the current law. As a result, federal debt is projected to steadily rising a trajectory through the coming decade ahead by the public, which has doubled in the past 10 years as a percentage of gross domestic product approaches 100% of GDP by 2028. Projected deficit over the 2018-2027 period has increased markedly since June of 2017, when the CBO issued its previous projection. The increase stems primarily from tax and spending legislation enacted since the established public law called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and called the 2017 Tax Act in this report. Bipartisan Budget Act there, and the Consolidated Appropriation Act. That was all 2018. The CBC's economic projection, which underlines its budget projection and outlines growth in at a faster pace this year than in 2017, as the recent changes in fiscal policy added existing momentum in spending on goods and services. Growth in actual GDP outpaced growth in potential, that is the maximum sustainable GDP, both this year and next year, pushing the unemployment rate down. After 2019, economic growth is projected to slow, matching the CBO's estimate of economic maximum stability growth. We've talked about that here in a modern industrial economy. Reading GDP, that is GDP adjusted to remove the effects of inflation, and real potential GDP are now projected to be greater throughout the coming decade than projected last June, in part because of significant recent changes in fiscal policy. Interest rates are projected to be higher and unemployment rates lower in the next few years. Even if federal law did generally remain in place, the budgetary and economic outcomes would be difficult to project and thus uncertain. The CBO's projections, especially its economic projections, are even more uncertain than usual this year. Economic growth is projected to be relatively strong this year and next, then it moderates. The CBO, growth, real GDP exceeds growth of real potential outcome over the next 2 years, putting upward pressure on inflation and interest rate figures for 2020 to 2026. A number of factors damper economic growth: higher interest rates and prices, slower growth in the federal outlays, and the expiration of the reduction in personal tax rates. After 2026, economic growth is projected to rise slightly, matching growth rate outputs by 2028. There's a lot of stuff going here. Economic growth between 18 and that's 10 years and 20. That would be 2018 and 20 actually, and 2028 actually, and the real output alike are projected to expand at an average rate of 1.9%. That's the average. Potential output is projected to grow more quickly than it has since the start of the what we call depression. That would be in 2007 to 2008. As the growth of productivity increases, nearly average over the past 25 years, and real changes in fiscal policy boost incentives to work, save, and invest. Needlessly, the potential output is projected to grow more slowly than it had early in the decade. The number of reasons for this: real GDP expanded by 3.3% of this year, and by 2.4%, that'd be in 2019. That was in, and it grew by 2.6% last year. Most of the growth input in the next 2 years is driven by consumer spending and business investment, but the federal spending also contributes significantly amount this year. After an average of 1.7% from 2020 through 2026, real GDP is projected to average about 1.8%. So a little under 2%. GDP is projected to be greater than the CBC's previous estimate. The GDP projections are growth to more quickly in the next few years. Level of the rates at 6.1% higher than the CBO's previous projection for 2027. So some of these are going to be deficit projections that to be larger by historic standards. Now I estimate that the this 2018 deficit will total 804 billion. That's 139 billion more than the 625 billion shortfall reported in 2017. Both amounts, however, are affected by shift in timing of some payments. Outlays in 18, thus the decade, have been reduced by 44 billion because of the October 1st, 2017 falls on a weekday. Some little quibbling here, as they call it. And let me get to the deficits and debts would be larger if some current policies were continued. Analyze the alternative scenarios in which current law was altered to maintain major policies that are now in place. More than 50 expiring revenue provisions were extended, including the individual income tax provision of 2017. Delays in implementing certain tax established by the Affordable Care Act were extended or made permanent. Schedule limits on discretionary appropriations did not take effect. More appropriations instead grew each year. Lawmakers provide inflation adjustment emergency appropriations for non-defense discretionary programs equal to the amount of such spending from 2012 to 2017. That's about 11 billion. So in other words, some projections were made. Let me move on here. And the effects of the partial shutdown ending in December. Again, this is from the Congressional Budget Office, known as the CBO. This is from December 22nd through January the 25th. Estimates that the 5-week shutdown delayed approximately 18 billion in federal discretionary spending for compensation and purchase of goods and services, and suspension of some. As a result, reduced economic activity. Real, that is inflation adjusted gross domestic product in the fourth quarter of 2018 was reduced by $3 billion in 2019 dollars in relation to what would have been otherwise. In the first quarter of 2019, the level of real GDP is estimated to be 8 billion lower than it would have been. As a share of quarterly real GDP, the level of real GDP in the fourth quarter of 2018 was reduced to 0.1%. That's the estimate of the CBC. And of the level of real GDP in the first quarter of this year, 2019, will be reduced by 0.2%. In subsequent quarters, GDP will temporarily higher than it would have been in the absence of the shutdown. Although most real GDP loss during the fourth quarter, Q4 and of 18 and Q1 of 19 will evidently be recovered. That the estimates that about 3 billion will not. The amount equals 0.02% of projected annual GDP in 19. In other words, the level of GDP. For the full calendar year is expected to be 0.02% smaller than it would. The underlying effects of the overall economy are not much more significant effects on the individual business and workers, although those who experience the largest and most direct negative effects are federal workers who face delayed compensation and private sector entities at loss of business. And we don't have the full figures on that. The effects on the federal budget because of the 5-week shutdown. Federal outlays, revenue, and other collections were lower than they would have been otherwise. With the resumption of funding, the CBC expects that nearly all the spending that did not occur during the shutdown will be made up, but the government will probably not fully recoup all the revenue. Spending. Affected departments and agencies' spending can be divided into two categories: workers' compensation and purchase of goods and services. Most people don't think of the purchase of goods and services. The CBC estimates that federal outlays for workers' compensation was reduced by $9 billion during the shutdown than they otherwise would. Of the total, $3 billion represents a compensation for furloughed workers. $9 billion represents compensation for except workers who are required to work even though they were compensation was delayed. Given the recent appropriation for funds for back pay for all affected workers, the CBC expects the federal compensation will be boosted by the same $9 billion over March and February and March, will otherwise be unaffected by the assessment. This is their assessment here. And goods and services, the estimate is that was about $9 billion lower. The CBC estimates 1/3 the reduction would be made up in the first, second, and third quarter. Revenue and collection delays in salary payments to federal workers during the 5-week shutdown will alter timing of tax revenues, no doubt about that. And the macroeconomic effects, which we're interested in here, of the shutdown, temporary reduction in the level of GDP. That decrease happened in 3 ways. Services were not provided by federal workers. Federal spending on goods and services were temporarily lower, and a temporary reduction in aggregate demand. Lower inputs in the private sector, even though GDP is expected to rebound with the resumption in funding. Some lost GDP will not be recovered. The underlying effects of the overall economy, however, are much more significantly distributed. A distributable effect, that is, the effect that redistribution income from some producers of goods and services to others. Indeed, some people and businesses experience significant negative effects, and all after the affected estimates of their timing is subject to considerable uncertainty. The effects on real GDP, we talked about that. That's in Q4 of 2018, less than 1/10% lower. And these are just estimates at this point in time, incidentally. Federal workers' hour and compensation, the national income and product accounts, which is maintained by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, includes comprehensive measurements of economic activity, such as GDP and its components. And with a resumption of funding, the number of hours worked by federal workers and their estimated contributions to real GDP are expected to return to passive following the absence of the shutdown. Well, most of them are working overtime now, trying to catch up. The effects on aggregate demand. Estimates that in the near term, the shutdown also suggests aggregate demand in the private sector for goods and services pushed down by GDP, the delay in federal compensation. A lot of these people did not get paid, and some of them actually will go out of business. The shutdown is expected to have a small temporary effect on the level of employment and unemployment rate, and this is back to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The distribution effects, in addition to having aggregate effects just described, the shutdown redistributed resources from some people and businesses to others. The redistribution happened in many ways. For some, a negative effect was substantial, and they went out of business. Many other businesses, by contrast, expected to see small temporary increases in demand as a result of the shutdown resumption of funding. Such businesses included that saw a pickup in demand for services provided to furloughed workers. In addition, resumption of funding and payment of delayed compensation is expected to temporarily boost aggregate demand. Aggregate demand can be boosted, and we won't get into that. We're just going to impinge this on. Our cast is going a little bit over where we want to be, and let me see where we're going here with this. I think we are finishing up our program here. We'll go to Reuters very quickly and give the Chinese estimate here. We're going to double down and get it from the market people. But what we will do, excuse me, is we may have a little bit of a time. Oh, here we go. The Kazakh PMI moderates, but still solid. This is a Reuters story from Beijing. The overall new orders ticked higher to 52.6 from 52.3 tenths, 0.3% higher there. But it was well above the fell to 53.6. This is the Marxist measurement, the PMI here, and we'll get it in a pinch, so we won't go. Have been hit by long-term restructuring there. There's something going on in China for a while. China's switched to more domestic situation, and this is both the PMI for service and manufacturing it slipped to 50.9 in January from 52.2. The January manufacturing PMI announced on Friday was 48.3, lower than February of 2016. Beijing has went through some measures there. Chinese service sector is holding up. Service firms add to their payroll numbers in January. Inflation pressures ease. And this is one of the things China had to work on. So basically, upbeat readings were consistent of there. So in other words, this is one of the things that we are always looking at is why China will go this way. Let's see if we can get. I think we'll have to take a station break. Go ahead and get the real PMI, WBRN radio. Okay, I'll just read from the actual one here. On a on a sector basis, growth continued to be driven by the service sector, which saw activity expand solidly at the start of the year. Notably, the seasonally adjusted Shenzhen China General Services Bureau Activity Index was down slightly from 53.9 to 53.6. I think we already reported that. With activity levels rising solidly, service companies in China continued to add workforce numbers in January. Though marginal, the job creation edged up to a 3-month high. Manufacturing employment remained a downward trend. And the key points here, service index continues to be solid, and new orders rise only slightly despite rebound export sales. Overall employment stabilizes, and this is some comments here from Dr. Zhang. He's director of macro economic analysis at the CEBM group. He said that the Caixin China General Services Activity Index came in at 53.3 in June, down slightly from the previous month's. Demand for services remained solid as increased new business accelerated marginally. The sub-index of employment rose pointed to a fast expansion of payroll services at service providers. And to go on with it here, which helped ease the pressure on companies' profit margins. However, the sub-index of business expectations declined from the previous month, indicating service providers weakening confidence in the outlook for the operation in the coming 12 months. The Caixin China Composite Output Index fell from 50.9 in January. The increase in new orders is softened, while new export business rose for the first time after dipping for 9 consecutive months. That suggests that the downward pressure on domestic demand was growing while external demand was holding up. The sub-index of employment rebounded to a break-even point of 50 after staying in contraction territory for 7 straight months. Underlying the government efforts to stabilize employment have taken effect, and the indicators of input prices and output prices both went down. Overall, the Chinese economic growth was weighted on by a weakening domestic demand in January, although exports improved marginally as Sino-U.S. trade negotiations flagged signs of progress in the efforts of the China's policy to support domestic demand, and the development of the trade war between the country and the U.S. will remain key to prospects of the Chinese economy, given the government has refrained from taking policies of strong stimulus. The downward trend of the economy may be hard to turn around from the beginning, and that is what we get. This is the market people here, and we will append this. This will do it for us on the 3rd of February 2019. This Week in Economics from WBRN Radio, the Bostonred Network, our partner Transton Analytics. In February, we'll see February is always a transitional month. The effects of the Arctic vortex will come into the effect. We'll probably get some of that next week. We still have not received the full aspects of the retailing month in December. We'll get some more activity there. Employment as in the U.S. is basically stabilized. It's stabilized somewhat in China. And the talks as far as the trade war is concerned, it probably will moderate. Where the accommodation will be very hard to say, because if we were talking just straight tariffs in this, that would be an easier thing to negotiate out. But they're also talking about intellectual properties rights there, which is something that is seen totally differently in the U.S. Than it is, say, in China. China is both an industrialized country and an emerging country. And the way the Chinese look at cyber activity, for instance, is different. And we hear lots about various spying by China, and we've had, of course, industrial, so-called industrial espionage here in North America, particularly U.S., Canada, etc., by home companies. And nothing new there. It has went on Huawei, the attempts by the U.S. to put pressure on them in their 5G network. They're rolling out these networks and want to roll them out all over the EU. And particularly they're in places like Kenya, across various African nations. They're going to roll out 5G there. And they are noted to have the best equipment. That's China and Huawei. And these are international companies with standings. Now, the whole idea of economic violence itself will become in coming years an outmoded tactic. We're seeing that in the sanctions against Iran and the European Union setting up quote-unquote a back channel, although it's only for humanitarian, so-called humanitarian aid, but it is a back channel. Now, the big question here on the international stage or global stage will other companies and various trading organizations like the Asian Trading Organization, etc., allow the U.S. to dominate? In other words, to dictate to member countries. Will China allow this? Will the Russian Federation allow this to happen? Because it hurts them economically. Its time is their growth. And now we look at Venezuela, where a number of countries are either supporting Venezuela, the government of Nicolas Maduro, or they're supporting this so-called self-proclaimed operator there in Venezuela that proclaimed himself, swore himself in. And this is the remnants of a Cold War policy and turning Venezuela into a banana republic. Very difficult to do in 2019. So long conflict could remain there. The followers of what are called after their late leader, Hugo Chavez, the Chavistas. The Chavistas have been in power now for 20 years. 20 years is a long time. It changes the dynamic of a country. Now, there has always been a right-wing force there in Venezuela. And what they want to do is bring in so-called food, basically, into Venezuela. But that is roughly a $20 million operation. And Venezuela has over $20 billion in a U.S. bank. So that's just a pittance. But what is happening over the region, if you look at it, the policies of many of these right-wing regimes, as in Brazil, neoliberals, etc., their ability to address 2019 economic conditions are causing problems. And one of the situations in Venezuela, they're talking about the IMF making them a loan. Well, the IMF has made a number of people loans, including Zimbabwe, and they could not pay off the loans. And they put austerity on the economy that's already austere. So in other words, those kinds of things don't work well at all. And we'll have, incidentally, further reports from the World Economic Forum. And we have all that stuff prepared, or nearly prepared. We'll get that out this week on the Numbers Man, a part of WBRN Radio and the Bostonred Network. We have some of those things pinned up here. And we'll talk about Venezuela, incidentally, on BR on the World and some of our other outlets. We're sort of behind here, but we will eventually get caught up with the information. Information flows very, very quickly, and given that we had to shut down and could have another shutdown, incidentally, in the middle of February, if the negotiations between the Trump administration and Congress do not work out. The stumbling block being the so-called wall, which has nothing to do with the economy, basically there. But these shutdowns effectively, and this was a shutdown of some government services, but they start to affect the whole government because they set up a bad cookie cutter. If you shut some departments down, you could end up next September, that's the end of the fiscal year, of the U.S. government's fiscal year, shutting down more government agencies, and the effect, particularly in heavy concentrated areas, D.C., Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, those areas, and all over the country where there are federal workers, and there are literally tens of thousands of federal contractors, from the large ones to very, very small ones. There was an article in the Washington Post about one federal contractor, been around about 15 years, couldn't make payroll, couldn't pay insurance carriers, some things. We'll have to go back and check and see how that turned out. Nonetheless, this will do it for us here at WBRN Radio and the Bostonred Network and Cranston Analytics. For those in business, have a productive week, and for consumers, obviously you are keeping your eyes on the consumer prize, and we haven't seen any great discounting out there. The levels for gasoline and petrol are low. They've been, we didn't do the numbers. Sorry about that. This is what happens when you get so focused. We'll get the numbers from the BBC very, very quickly here, and we'll do the numbers. Just literally almost let it slip by us. Okay, let's go to the FTSE first. The FTSE at 0.74%. It was up. The rest of Europe, Amsterdam, they were at 0.05%. In France, they were at 0.53%. The DAC was at 0.07%. And the Eurostat at 0.37%. And in Madrid, they were down a negative 0.41%. In Bombay, they were 0.59. Hang Seng was down, not 0.40. The Nikkei at not a 0.07%. And to the Dow Jones, where'd they go? At 0.26%, and the Nasdaq was a negative 0.25%. And in Chicago, how the BBC puts it, a 0.9 there. And let's see, commodities. Brent crude futures were at $62.75. That was up $3.14. And the West Texas Intermediate was at $55, or is at $55.26. That was up 2.73% there. Actually, if we look at this, sorry about that, the dollar changes $1.47 for Texas Intermediate, and $1.91 for Brent crude. TB picking is still jumping for joy there. And gold on the Forex was down 0.31. That's down $1.75 at $1,320. And I don't know, we probably don't have silver here. Didn't miss it. Yeah, that's all we got, basically speaking. We don't have anything else. So that is the numbers. We almost left out. Sorry about that. We won't go to Bloomberg this week because we just simply don't have time. Final good day.